今天您将收看的是。
今晚我们看电影，马其顿裔导演米尔科·曼彻夫斯基为您解读电影中真实与虚构的边界。
您好，观众朋友，欢迎收看今晚我们看电影。来自美国纽约的马其顿裔导演曼彻夫斯基，带着他的影片《比基尼穆恩》来到了第21届上海国际电影节。这位曾经获得威尼斯国际电影节金狮奖的导演，有着非同凡响的艺术理念和追求。今天的节目当中，就让我们和他一起聊聊他的电影理念。
马其顿裔导演米尔科·曼彻夫斯基现身第21届上海国际电影节。在金爵奖的颁奖晚会上，曼彻夫斯基作为颁奖嘉宾之一，把最佳导演奖项颁发给了加拿大导演巴鲁索兄弟。而在2017年，他则是金爵奖的评委之一。这已是曼彻夫斯基连续2年参与上海国际电影节了。
So I'm very happy to be in Shanghai again. It's an honor to come to the festival, second year in a row. Hope it becomes a nice tradition. For me, it's a great gateway into the Chinese culture. Culture that I've been interested in for ages now, wanted to learn more about it. And it's also a great way of meeting fellow filmmakers, meeting scholars who work in the field of arts and film, such as Professor Feng Wang, for example. It's interesting to see that this festival is it's so big, it's huge. There's just a large number of films being shown, and a lot of people come and attend, which is something that distinguishes this film festival from most of the other festivals in the world.
除了作为颁奖嘉宾，此次曼彻夫斯基来到上海国际电影节，带来的是他的新作《比基尼穆恩》，片名就是主角的名字。一位曾经在伊拉克前线服役的女兵。影片围绕着女兵回国后的故事展开。按照曼彻夫斯基的说法，他用纪实的手法聚焦真实与虚构的边界。
One is I wanted to talk about somebody who has mental issues and their difficulty in fitting in with society. I also wanted to talk about the plight of the veterans, of people who fought for that country, and then the country turns its back on them. Ultimately, it's a film about, human emotions. It's about joy and sorrow and pain. At the same time, as an artist, I'm always interested in experimenting and in trying to play and trying to explore the structure of the medium itself. But with each film, I try to do something completely different from the previous films. So that's part of the reason it could be considered surprising if you want to compare it to the previous work. And ultimately, I was trying to talk about the ethics or the morality of the filmmakers and the particularly documentary filmmakers, and the question of how they affect what they report on, but also how, in our case with Bikini, how the subject comes back and affects the film and changes the film.
No. 曼彻夫斯基已经不是第一次来到上海了。相比去年的忙碌行程，这次电影节期间，他显得轻松许多。
This is the first time I encounter such an environment, and it makes me think of. It's the first time I encounter such environment, and seeing the place, the gardens, the buildings, the bridges, the canals makes me think of. So this is the first time I'm in an environment like this. I like visiting old towns, old villages, old constructions, old buildings. Part of it is just the curiosity of an artist. Part of it is the photographs that I take. But visiting a place like this, seeing the buildings, the canals, the bridges, the gardens, makes me think of what life would have been like ages ago.
对曼彻夫斯基而言，摄影是一件非常个人化的事情，比电影更能接近艺术的本质。2017年，曼彻夫斯基曾在上海举办他在中国的首个摄影展。作品中所展现的平凡生活，犹如歌曲中的音符一般生动。
I always bring my 2 cameras with me. One is the little Instamatic camera, which still has produces pictures of high quality. The other one is my iPhone. The lenses are different. The quality is different. I like taking pictures of street life, street photography. I like the moment where the mundane and the eternal meet, where they cross paths. I like the encounter of the coincidence and the aesthetic.
接下来您将收看的是
出生于马其顿的曼彻夫斯基，在美国攻读影视专业后，将这些历史的伤痛凝练成一出悲剧。1994年，曼彻夫斯基凭借处女作《暴雨将至》一举夺得威尼斯电影节金狮奖。
曼彻夫斯基早在上世纪90年代就以一部《暴雨将至》震撼了影坛。在他看来，电影只是一种载体，这是他与观众进行艺术沟通和交流的艺术表达。
巴尔干大地上浸润着太多生命中难以承受的苦难。出生于马其顿的曼彻夫斯基，在美国攻读影视专业后，将这些历史的伤痛凝练成一出悲剧。1994年，曼彻夫斯基凭借处女作《暴雨将至》一举夺得威尼斯电影节金狮奖。1995年，该片获得奥斯卡最佳外语片奖提名。这位马其顿青年导演以对自己祖国的无边爱意和无力回天的痛苦感情，打动了评委和观众。
You know, telling stories is easy for me. So telling a linear story is boring. I find it boring while making a film. But to be serious about it, I'm interested in experimenting with ways to tell a story and ways to make art. And playing with the structure is one of those ways of being innovative, being creative and experimenting.
暴雨将至以3段独立的故事来刻画同一主题，3个故事平行发展，相互影响，共同推进，直至最终结局。曼彻夫斯基以实验性的手法来处理时空与叙事形式，超越现实又植根于马其顿土壤的厚重悲剧，反暴力和反战的主题跃然而出。
Well, I think violence is terrible. Violence is disgusting. It's ugly. I'm scared of violence. And that's the dark side of the human nature. And I think it's important to talk about it, to confront it, not to glorify it, but to ritualize it. And by talking about it, by discussing it, by seeing it, I think we come to terms with what violence means and how to prevent it. And I think the artist, the filmmaker, should be responsible, should approach violence in a realistic way. Violence is ugly, and it should be ugly the way it's portrayed in a film.
暴雨将至有3段情节相对独立的故事，而3段故事都是以死亡结尾。在这片充满暴力和冲突的土地上，冰冷的死亡与灼热的情感注定长久相依，繁衍生息。
I like a good tragedy. I think a good tragedy makes for a good drama, for a good film. And it's just a personal inclination in the work that I do and the stories that I tell. And even though there's death in the film and there's love that falls apart, ultimately I think the film is bittersweet. It's a bit of a reflection of a cynical optimist that I am. The film ends on a high note, even though there's a threat of imminent violence everywhere around the main protagonists.
隐喻不仅是电影语言美学的体现，同样也升华着影片的主题。暴雨将至中这样的隐喻存在于台词、构图与用光之中。导演借由这些隐喻来激发观众的共鸣，也寻找着那种令人感动而遥远的相似性。
Well, I like contrasts, and I like combining elements that seem as if they don't go together. So in my most recent film that has been released, Mothers, I combine fiction with a documentary, which is not something you often do in a film. In Before the Rain and in Dust, I combine countries and periods that usually don't go together. So, to answer your question, in Before the Rain, there's London and then there's the Macedonian mountains, two locations that you think would not go together. But by putting them together, I draw parallels and contrasts. And ultimately, we come to a conclusion that people are the same everywhere. People have similar kind of hopes and they love in a similar way or they're sad in a similar way.
时间不是，圆圈不圆，三个故事平行发展。年轻僧人收留逃亡少女，名摄影师女友怀孕，摄影师回到马其顿老家。三个片段相互影响，推向震撼性结局。叙事体上的回环结构象征了巴尔干半岛连绵不绝的战事。
The reason I wrote the line was just to reinforce, to emphasize the structure of the film. And the structure of the film is circular with a quirk, with a twist, with a bend. It's like an optical illusion in time, like an Escher drawing in time. So the reason the line is there is just to make it clear to the audience that what they're watching and what they're perceiving as an imperfect circle is indeed the filmmaker's intention.
Polega vedete. Vremето никога ще си умира, а и кругът не е търкалец.
Before the Rain is not a documentary about what was going on in Macedonia, or it's not a documentary about what was going on in what used to be Yugoslavia. It's a piece of fiction, and as such, it speaks of higher truth than what the actual events on the ground were. I believe that the actual events need to be reported by journalists, by historians, by anthropologists. And the artist needs to speak of higher truth, something that hopefully every human being can relate to, rather than telling of specific events and specific place in the world.
如果说画面是一部电影的直观外在，那么音乐和音效则可能是贯穿整部作品的灵魂。暴雨将至中富含民族性的音乐，仿佛这片土地的悠远叹息，而若即若离的音效设置更丰满了人物的形象与内在。
Well, I mean, film is a complex piece, and there's a whole bunch of elements. It's the story, it's the acting, it's the visuals, and obviously it's the sound and the music. I used a lot of subliminal sounds in both films, things that are not obvious and that are incongruous. For example, whenever you see the girl, Zamira, we hear the sound of a cat in the background, even though we don't see the cat. Or whenever you see, very often when you see Alexander the photographer, you hear an elephant. And those are leitmotifs. That's as far as the sound. The music is a contemporary interpretation of traditional folk music and Byzantine music, seen through a contemporary prism, both in Before the Rain, in Dust, well, also in Shadows and Mothers, my other films. I think if one could make a film without music, it would be really difficult. But if it works, then I think it would be stronger than a film that has music.
在暴雨将至、大获赞誉后的第7年，曼彻夫斯基推出了他的又一部作品《尘土》，力求在叙事技巧再续突破。在影片中，观众看到了一个双主线、时空交错且黑白与彩色画面并用的故事。曼彻夫斯基也愈发显示出建构精巧复杂叙事结构的能力。
Well, to her, it's a lifeline. To the motto of the film is, "Where does your voice go when you're no more?" And she senses that she's about to die. She's very old. I think we all want to tell stories. We all need to tell stories. We love telling stories. That makes us feel alive, and it makes us feel as if we are part of the community. So it's part of our DNA, the need to tell stories and to hear stories.
No, scusa, fammi capire, perché cazzo l'ascolto questa storia e cosa cazzo c'entra con te?
Così saprai dove cazzo seppellirlo.
Sì, beata te. Lo vedi questo? Seppelliranno prima me, cazzo.
Chiama gli sbirri. Pollicino.
Ma non prendermi per il culo!
Anche tu puoi dire la tua. Preferisci 20? 20 vanno benissimo. Un pignolo creativo, sei un controsenso vivente. Erano 20.
Dust deals with different ways of telling a story. It could be a family history, it could be a legend, a myth, it could be real history, it could be a joke, could be an anecdote, could be a lie, that's also telling a story. And the Western myth was part of myself when I was growing up on the comic books and on the Western movies, but also it's part of the cultural heritage of the world. So in dealing with myths, dealing with the myth of the cowboy, of the Western, was pretty important. Was pretty essential. Dust plays with those elements. It questions, it juxtaposes the myth versus the actual fact versus history.
尘土以西部片的外观包装起巴尔干民族的苦难神话，是曼彻夫斯基对本民族沉重社会现实所做出的又一次深切反思。他以影像表达对暴力、民族、家庭乃至整个人类生存境遇的思考与忧虑，更再度强调了一名电影人的责任感。
I think that the violence I mean, there is some violence in Dust, but it's nothing compared to a lot of other mainstream films. So I think the audience is fortunately or unfortunately used to seeing violence in the films. I mean, you can look at the violence in Saving Private Ryan by Spielberg, for example, and Dust is a child's play compared to it. But I think it's important for for a serious filmmaker, not to manipulate violence, not to use it, not to trivialize it. I think it's much more dangerous when you see dozens or hundreds of people just being shot and discarded easily with a smirk, with a joke, than seeing the pain of a person dying for hours and pissing in his pants and vomiting while he or she is dying. I think that's the responsible thing to do when dealing with violence. film and photography are sort of similar but very different at the same time, and that's another element of contrast that I bring into the films. It's not something I do consciously, it just seems to work well, using a photographer and using photography and a character who deals with photography a lot. And then once intuitively it feels right, once I start working with it, I often realize that they're echoes, they're reflections of using such a motif, and then I amplify them and use them much more. Photography, for example, is different from film in that it captures the moment, and that the viewer is in charge of how long it would take to absorb the photograph, while with film, it's the director who decides how long the shot is. It could be rapid, it could be very slow. So in a way, photography is more democratic towards the viewer, and I like introducing that aspect, as well as the aspect of freezing a moment of history for future generations to contemplate.
每到一个城市，曼彻夫斯基总是会深入到每一个大街小巷，记录这城市的一切。记录对于他来讲是一种本能的表达。非常感谢您收看今晚，再见。
明天您将收看的是
85岁高龄的法国电影大师科斯塔·加夫拉斯携他的代表作《焦点新闻》《八音盒》《疑点在西方》等名作来到上海，为影迷们献上加夫拉斯作品展。